In this next lesson, we're going to take a look at the customer master files within X3. So kind of continuing from our prior lessons on leads and prospects, let's go through the exercise of creating a customer, and we're going to create this customer by converting it from a prospect. So again, if I come to my common data menu, then in here to my BPs block, and over to prospects. So here's our prospect record that we created in our last lesson. Now, for organizations that kind of have approval processes that need to be kind of stepped through before a prospect can be converted into a full-fledged customer, maybe the prospect needs to be reviewed by the credit department, for instance. There's a couple different reports that we have in here on the prospect that the user can print. One would be if I come over to my print icon, then come to this record. This is going to give me the prospect file. So I'm going to come over here to the right and do a print. Okay, I'm going to open it with my Adobe Reader. Okay, so here's an example of the prospect file here with the prospect ID number, their name, all their address information, sales rep informations are all going to be contained herein. Okay. Another report that might be of interest down here under the print button, again under lists. We have different lists that we can pull up. This top one here, this prospect list, can be handy when converting prospects. This list right here is basically going to give you a register of all prospects that are in the system that may or may not be eligible to be converted into a customer. Okay. So at any rate, once the prospect is authorized to become a customer, right here from within the prospect file, I can come over and click on the customer button. And that's going to invoke the conversion process. So now, over here on my customer file, the category carries over. It's flagged as being an active customer. And again, if there ever comes a point in time where the organization wishes to cease doing business with the customer, one can just uncheck that active box. Okay. Down here on the Identity tab, all the legal name, tax IDs, SIC codes are all going to carry forth from your prospect record. Here on the Addresses tab, your address again is going to carry over. Now here on the addresses, a couple things to make note of. You'll see here we have an Addresses tab and we also have a Ship to Customer tab. Now how these two kind of tie together is you might be doing business with an organization whereby this main address is kind of the corporate headquarters, and it's not really an eligible ship to address. It's not where you're going to be sending your parts or the goods that you're selling. So down here you can actually create additional address codes. So I could come in here and maybe do like an SH01 to designate this as the the first ship to address. Okay. And again, over here in the title, okay. Then once that's established, I can come over here to my Ship To tab, and in this block here, what I'm going to say is that this main address here, this one, wants to, well, I tell you what, we'll get to that Ship To here in order. I'm going to make these a cash customer. Okay. Delete that. Replace that with my ship to. Okay. Language. I'm going to specify as English. Okay. We have special taxing rules for this particular ship to locations. From our tax table setup, we can go ahead and define that herein, from all our available options. Okay. Again, if you have variability in sales reps depending upon the ship to location, those can be defined herein. Down here in our reports block, we can come here to specify whether or not when doing our order fulfillment, if we need to generate picking ticks and packing slips. We can specify the default work days at the client. And we can also come in here to define an unavailable calendar. So, your various holidays, New Year's, Memorial Day, 4th of July, and so forth. Those can all be set up on an unavailable calendar and specified here on the customer. And again, we're going to indicate this as being an active ship to address. In this delivery field here, one can come in and specify for this particular address which shipping site from within your organization is going to fill the orders. Okay. We have information here for loaning and subcontracting if the customer's of that special type. If your organization has its own fleet of trucks, that each run their own individual routes, a route code can be specified on the ship to. The delivery priority here, we have our standard, normal, urgent, and very urgent. So depending upon the typical, criticality of orders for this customer, you can go ahead and set this up accordingly. Then when a sales order is entered, X3 will pick up on that. We have a delivery mode in here that we can specify. We'll call this a ground customer. This delivery lead time here represents the amount of days it typically takes to get from your facility to the customer's facility. If there's a standard carrier that transports the cargo, in our carrier list, we can reference that herein. Your Incoterms here, we can choose from the different terms that we set up. In this case, I'm going to call it an FOB. Okay. Let's go ahead and let's that in caps. Okay. And in this one, I'm also going to flag this as being our default ship to for the client. Okay, so you can see how we have kind of a close tie-in between this ship to tab and this addresses tab back here. And again, in this model, I'm saying that the main address isn't an eligible ship to. There go. There's no need to define it over in this block. Okay, so let's go ahead and return to the commercial tab here. So here on the commercial tab, in our ordering section, we have an ABC classification that we can assign to the customer. So, if we do a grading scale of sorts for our customers, we can flag them. We can set up a minimum order amount. Okay, so if your organization's policy is that you don't accept any order under, $100 US or 100 euros in this case, we could go ahead and set that up accordingly. This allow order close, what that has tie-in to is that typically within X3, when you ship a sales order, when you ship it in full or you ship it within tolerance, it's going to automatically flag the order as being closed. But if your organization runs into cases where maybe you didn't have enough inventory on hand to fulfill the order, and the customer doesn't want a back order situation, they just wish for you to close out the order, it's going to be necessary to set this allow order close, so that the authorized user can flag the sales order as being closed even though it hasn't been fulfilled in full. This next block down here, the one order per delivery, what this setting here ensures is that when you take a look at the sales order fulfillment cycle within X3, you're going to go from the sales order to the delivery to the invoice. In this model, if you have this box checked, that works to ensure that there's a one-to-one relationship between the order and the delivery record. Some organizations wish to consolidate multiple sales orders on a common delivery record, and if that in fact is the case, you're going to want to go ahead and leave that unchecked. Also, as it relates to delivery, we have these partial delivery settings. If back orders are allowed by your customer, you can go ahead and set the partial delivery as being allowed. We have this ship line complete setting, meaning that if you have a multi-line sales order, the customer allows back order situations, but they don't want, if you only say on one line of the sales order you only have 9 of the 10 units that they require for that product, and you wish to prohibit just shipping the 9 units, you can go ahead and flag it as ship line complete. Then finally you have the ship order complete, which basically prohibits any back orders. Okay. It's important to note that these settings here are going to be inherited by the sales order that's created for the customer, and those settings can also be overridden on the individual sales order. So that is to say, maybe you have a case where typically the customer, they don't allow back orders, but they run into a special order for which they're really in need of the material. On that particular sales order, you'd be able to flip it over to allowed. Okay. Over here we have a loan authorization setting. So if your organization loans equipment, let's say, to clients, that whereby the expectation is they're going to send those machinery back to you, you can set up the customer to for loan authorization. This setting here for your price type is it indicates whether or not your price is inclusive of tax or exclusive of tax. Okay. In our invoicing block over here, we have settings in here as it relates to the freight invoicing. Prototypically, I'll see clients set this up with the invoiced setting. There is a settings on the carrier files within X3, whereby if you have relationships with your carriers where you have fixed freight rates to get from location A to location B, you can actually establish that on the freight carrier, then in part leverage these threshold settings with that. Your invoicing mode here, one invoice per shipment, I would say is the prototypical option that I'll see most clients utilize. Other options within here is we have we want one invoice for each closed sales order that is that's been completed in the system, one sales invoice for each order. Okay, so if you have multiple shipments that go out against a given order and you want to consolidate those onto a single invoice, you have one invoice per ship to. Okay, so if you had multiple ship to locations defined on a sale or on an invoice line by line basis, we can do one per period here. So that one per period option would kind of in part fold in with this invoice period. Okay, so maybe you have customers that only get a bill, say, on a weekly basis or maybe once per month. We can go ahead and model it as such within here. Okay. Then finally here we have a manual option where this would probably just be appropriate for organizations that do a relatively few number of invoices on a daily basis, and you don't want to kind of capitalize upon the automated invoicing routines that X3 has available to you. You could go ahead and just set them up as manual. Okay. The due date origin. Okay, so on the invoices that's generated, typically it's going to be the invoice date, which would represent the start of your aging. You can also set that to the shipping date. Okay. Many organizations like to model it where the date of the shipment equals the date of the invoice, and X3 has there's ways by which to model that within X3, so they're right in step. Down here in this next section here for discounts and charges, this is where one can come to specify any kind of below the line charge or discount that's associated with the customer. So maybe the situation is such that from a freight perspective, whenever you ship goods to this particular customer, they get charged $150 for freight, regardless of the size of the shipment. One can go ahead and establish that at the customer level. Then when the respective invoice or sales order and ultimately the invoice is generated for the client, those records will automatically inherit what we have set up herein. Okay. Here in the sales rep section, again, this is just being inherited over from the prospect. We have our commission categories. So again, if we have different commission rates based upon different categories of customer, we can set that up accordingly. We can set up a primary sales rep and a secondary sales rep on the account. Here in our report section, if we want X3 to prompt for the printing of the acknowledgement record, we can go ahead and flag that accordingly. This template code block, what this has some application for is in X3 we can set up, we're going to be setting up crystal reports to represent your sales order acknowledgement, your picking tickets, your packing slips, your invoices, and those crystal reports are going to be generated. Now, what we can do is, let's just say for sake of discussion that the majority of our clients just get our standard invoice, and our standard acknowledgement. We can go ahead and set up our standard crystal reports to reflect that. But, maybe we have a client that is, located within France, and we need to ensure that when we generate the acknowledgments out of the system or generate the invoices out of the system, it's printed out in the appropriate language. You can have special crystal reports in the French language developed. Then through this print template setting here, go ahead and reference that on the client. So when X3 is going through its billing routines and it's generating the invoices per se, it knows that when it hits an invoice for this client to go ahead and print out the French form as opposed to the English form. Okay. Another popular application we see for this print template is not only with respect to the languages, but maybe you have a particular customer, when you send out the packing slips, you need to maybe you're in part shipping those goods to one of their clients, and kind of a third party direct, and that packing slip can't go out with your company's logo on it. It needs to go out with a blind packing slip, or maybe even a packing slip with your customer's letterhead. Through this print template concept, you can actually, again, model in special reports that'll be called when you're going through your shipping process. Here on the Management tab, we have different settings here in the Miscellaneous block. The majority of your customers are going to go in under a normal basis. One could also set up a customer with this miscellaneous setting, and that might be appropriate, to designate customers that maybe you're only doing business with on a one-time basis, or maybe you're a web retailer and you just set up a generic customer file, and on an order-by-order basis you specify, new address information. You can go ahead and use that miscellaneous setup to facilitate that. Here in this next field, this is where you can put in, your account number in your customer's system. We have a rate type here. This is going to be used if we're doing business with the client in a foreign denomination. X3 allows for the definition of multiple currency exchange rate tables. So you could set up daily rate tables and monthly rate tables, average rate tables, and so forth. And this is basically allows you to point to which exchange rate table is applicable. Here in our credit control section, 3 settings here for the credit control: the check, the no check, and the hold. The check setting right here, what that amounts to is every time a sales order is input into the system, X3 is going to check the current outstanding balance that customer has versus his credit line. And in the event that that sales order puts them over the line, the sales order is going to be flagged with a limit exceeded setting in the credit authorization block. So that then in part would necessitate either for the increase of the credit line on the customer, or for your credit manager to go in and set the release box on the sales order. Okay. The no check option would be maybe appropriate for intercompany sales orders, or maybe you do business with certain business partners for which maybe credit's simply not a concern. You can go ahead and use the no check setting. Then finally we have this hold setting here. Now when you use the hold setting on a customer, basically that means that each and every sales order that's input into the system is going to go on credit hold, and the credit manager is going to need to approve each one of those orders for release before they can be fulfilled. Okay. Again, authorized credit here is the line of credit. This total credit level, this is going to reflect to you the amount. It can represent a couple different things depending upon the way that you have the system parameterized. Your total credit level on one hand could just be a representation of your outstanding receivables on the customer's account. Alternatively, you can also set up the system to include not only the receivables but also the orders that they have in backlog, to kind of maybe give you a more fuller picture of the exposure that your organization has with the client. Down here in the credit insurance section here, this would be applicable if you insure your receivables with a third-party insurance agent. And this amount of credit insurance that you specify is also going to feed into the factoring of whether or not an order is limit exceeded. Down here in our management section here, one can come in to establish if you do have like a points program, like what a hotel or an airline would do with their clients. You can set up your points programs on the customer. Here in your statistical group section, again, these are 3 different subcategorizations that you can assign to your customer to kind of further break the details out. And from a customer perspective, these are typically pretty popular features because these statistical groups can be rolled right into your sales analysis. So not only are you able to get your sales details, say, by the category in which the customer falls, but you can also get the sales details for each one of these statistical groups that you assign to them. Next, over here on the Financials tab, here in this section, this is where in the BP's block one can come to specify the bill to customer account and the pay by account. Now, for many customer accounts, the customer ID here is going to be the same as the billing party and the pay by party. A certain exception to that rule might be if you're doing business with a subsidiary, a subsidiary organization, and it's to their corporate parent that you send their invoices, or it's from their corporate parent that you receive payment. In that situation, that's where you might have a difference in the kind of the sold to customer here versus the party that you're billing and that you're being paid by. Now that paid by really can have a nice application if you're doing business with multiple, call them sister companies. So maybe you're billing, customers A, B, and C all independently, and customers A, B, and C are all subsidiaries of company D. You could go through and set up company D as the pay by on each one of those entities, so that when you receive a payment from company D, when you're recording that payment, X3 makes it easy for you to record that payment against the invoices that you sent out to all the subsidiary companies. Here we have the group customer concept. This group customer, it's kind of oftentimes part and parcel. If you have difference between your pay by and your primary customer, the group customer, is often modeled in the same way. It's more so used, strictly speaking, for statistical reporting. We have a risk BP that we can assign to the customer. This risk BP, again, going back to that same example, maybe you're not interested in managing your credit exposure on each one of the subsidiary entities, but rather you want to manage credit on the corporate level, their parent level. You can go ahead and set up the parent as the risk business partner. We have an accounting code setting over here. Ultimately, this accounting code is going to define the applicable revenue and accounts receivable accounts that should be called out when you're doing your invoicing to the customer. This account structure block right here kind of works part and parcel with the accounting code, but it allows you to kind of get a finer measure or a more detailed measure of accounting to be driven from the customer level. This factor field over here, this is going to be would only be used in cases where you're selling your receivables to a third-party financial institution. That's referred to as a factor, and they can be set up on the customer if you use those. We have the general tax rule. Okay, so if you have to accrue for sales tax liability when you bill your customer, you can go ahead and set that up on the financial level, and that's typically appropriate if the customer only has one address, located in one taxing jurisdiction. As we mentioned before, back here on the Ship To tab, you can also define your tax rules here, because ultimately, in particular in the United States, the sales tax is going to be based upon the ship to location, not the sold to. If the customer is tax exempt, we can go ahead and put in their exemption number here. We have the payment terms associated with the customer. So if they're a cash customer, net 30, net 45, net 60, and so forth is going to be defined in this block. Over here, another important field is going to be the settlement discount. If the customer's entitled to an early payment discount of, maybe if they pay within 10 days, they can take a 0.5% off the invoice. That can be set within the settlement discount. We have a default bank that can be specified at the customer level. So when you're recording your cash receipts, X3 is going to record that activity into the appropriate bank account on your books. We have an unavailable calendar that we can specify. We have reminder letters that can be sent out to the customer. So those reminder letters are going to be governed by the parameters that we set herein. X3, for those organizations that do a lot of business on a credit card basis, Within X3, you can get the system linked over to Sage Exchange and it's kind of a full-featured integration where you can do an authorization at the time in which the sales order is entered, and ultimately a date when the invoice is issued out. Over here on the Bank ID tab, this is where we can specify any bank account information that we want to have set up for the customer. Then we also have our Contacts tab where we can register all the contacts associated with your customer.